Okay, we're going to talk about the persecuted church tonight, and we're in some momentum, really, in our series in the book of Acts, which is all about how the early church kept momentum through all kinds of growing pains and challenges. And one of the major growing pains and challenges of the church was the issue of persecution. Of course, persecution is not just a New Testament phenomena. It's very, very real in the world today. Operation World, what am I talking about? Open Doors, which is an organisation that exists really to support the persecuted church. They estimated last year 7,000 Christians around the world were killed because of their faith. And that is just the tip of the iceberg of millions of Christians who faced a variety of degrees of persecution: sexual violence, discrimination, lack of education, physical aggression, discrimination by government, restrictions on movement, a whole range of degrees of persecution. And for me, my household, we meet every week at, my household, some of us get up early in the morning, 7:15. You can join us if you'd like to. ADH, 7:15, in our basement, we meet to pray for the persecuted church. And we use the book by that organisation that I just said, which was Open Doors, exactly. Just checking. Just got my brains a bit fuddled at the moment. I've been away for 3 weeks. Open Doors have got a book which goes through the 50 most persecuting nations of the world. And it's interesting why nations persecute, why people are vulnerable there. We'll talk more of that anon. But Open Doors actually came to Bristol to speak to our student community. A worker from their organisation came a few weeks ago, and the student pastor were gathering, and Chris had actually primed one of the students during the presentation to rush into the room with a fake gun and to get everybody lined up against the wall to kind of really make the atmosphere more intense and more realistic for them. Unfortunately, one of the girls from the group was in the loo at the time, and she just heard all this kicking off, so of course she phoned the police. And the police kept her calm for 5 minutes while they arrived. There was nothing to see here, nothing to report. Anyway, it was all fine. Though it's quite interesting, isn't it, that in our country, we trust the police to be just. And that if we were experiencing religious persecution, that we've got a resource to call on. Actually, you could find in other countries of the world the opposite would be true. That the police would collude with persecution and make it worse. So we're going to start tonight, though, with a reading of Scripture, and we're going to go into the book of Acts. And this is the story of Stephen at the end of Acts chapter 7, going through into Acts chapter 8. Stephen, one of the early Christian workers, and someone whose ministry, which was originally a very practical one, he was a significant leader, both in word and in deed, in miracles. He was very, very effective, and was actually making a significant influence for the Christian message. And so he was brought before the Jewish authorities, and in his kind of trial, he just kind of gave some really orthodox Jewish theology. Told the story, that this story is my story, your story is my story, he said. And then he nailed it by basically reflecting on how the Jewish history had been one where the message of God and the prophets of God were persecuted. And then he said, and look what you've done to Jesus Christ. And this is where we kick in with the passage. So up we go, Stu, again with that slide. When they heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. Everybody turn around and gnash your teeth at someone, will you? It's good. Stop now. Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven, saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. At this, they covered their ears, and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. And while they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then he fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. When he had said this, he fell asleep, and Saul was there giving approval to his death. And on that day, a great persecution broke out against the church of Jerusalem. And all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria, godly men, buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off men and women and put them in prison. And those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Philip went down to a city in Samaria and proclaimed the Christ there. The church knew about persecution even before this event. The apostles themselves had been flogged and threatened by the religious authorities. Peter and James had been imprisoned. James had been beheaded. Did that happen before or after this? Can't remember. Anyway, it was all kicking off in the early church. And basically, the early church knew what it was to suffer persecution from the word go. So why persecution? There's a lot of reasons why persecution may happen. And of course, the Christian church is not the only victim of persecution. And indeed, the Christian church, the institutional Christian church, has been a persecuting body in its history and probably still is around the world today. But here's some reasons why persecution happens. First of all, because it's a threat to political and totalitarian powers. The church gets persecuted when it's big enough, significant enough, influential enough to be able to be a challenge to dominant totalitarian mindsets, whether they're religious mindsets or political mindsets, whether it's communism or whether it's religious fundamentalism that will not allow any freedom or tolerance. And when the church is big enough to be visible and to be at all perceived as a threat, persecution can kick in at those times. Second of all, religious dogma or prejudice is an issue. Jesus himself said this would happen. He said, John 16, verse 2, Jesus says, there will come a time when people will think that they're pleasing God by killing you, putting you to death. And I suppose that's always been true, but we live in such a time, don't we? We live in a time where around the world, various religious extremists, particularly militant Islam, believes that they are fulfilling the will of God by persecuting and by killing people who will not convert to Islam. They believe they're doing the will of God. That's a very difficult issue to face and to combat. Another form of religious persecution can come around religious jealousy. And again, fear of loss of influence in a religious context. And that can actually happen even within Christian groupings. You know, it's often said that the greatest enemy of a revival is the previous revival. It can happen where a new work of God appears and the older one feels very threatened. And so in our own country, we've seen many examples where the new initiatives that God has raised up, whether it's Methodism or the Salvation Army or whatever it is, have actually been resisted to the point of persecution by people associated with institutional church. So John Wesley would face kind of mobs of people throwing stones at him, trying to take his life, and on, really. It could also be, of course, that the issue around persecution is where culturally choosing to follow God, choosing to follow Jesus is perceived as a sort of treachery to your cultural grouping. And the kind of nationalism and tribalism and cultural identity factors that exist in the world can mean that if you decide to follow Jesus, then you're leaving your roots, your family, your inheritance. You're becoming Western in a non-Western society or whatever it is. And those traits actually can penetrate even to our own societies and cultures. I think, it's not at all unusual for families to perceive it as disloyal if people convert to Christianity and Christianity becomes more important than other things in their life previously. And if people don't share that faith, they can see it as a disloyalty and they can resist it and oppose it in all kinds of ways. I think sometimes persecution can happen because of crass, unwise, or negative behavior by the group that's being persecuted. And Paul, again, in his writings to the early church, is very savvy about that. and talks quite a lot about good citizenship. It's kind of the message is basically, if you're going to get persecuted for the right reason, not the wrong reason. Get persecuted, if you get persecuted for doing good, that's fine. But don't get persecuted for just being unpleasant. And sometimes mass movements, even Jesus followers, we can be a bit crass, can't we? We can come out with some stuff that is really a little bit offensive and it puts people back up. And we need to be wise about that kind of thing. But persecution also happens, and I think that behind many forms of persecution, this is true. That persecution happens because there's a demonic hatred of God and the people of God and the things of the kingdom of God. And in some cases, the more the people of God look like the person they're following, the more they look like Jesus, the more they represent his kingdom, the more there's evidence of the power at work, the more threatening they are, not just the political kingdoms, but the unseen spiritual kingdoms behind them, the more persecution kicks off. C.S. Lewis famously once said that miracles and martyrdoms go together in church history. And if we look at the life of Jesus, we can see that when he did signs and wonders, there was a backlash, particularly the raising of Lazarus from the dead, which was an outstanding miracle. That precipitated the cross. That precipitated the religious authorities saying, this man must die. He's getting too influential. He's too powerful. But behind what they were saying, the malice of Satan. For the disciples, you remember, when the lame man's raised, Peter and John meet him at the Gate Beautiful in Acts 4, and it's an outstanding miracle. That kicks off persecution. It's always been like that. The life of Paul. There's Paul in Philippi, and there's a demon cast out of a slave fortune teller, and immediately, they're kind of flogged and thrown into prison. Persecution kicks off on the back of kingdom activity. So there are all kinds of reasons why persecution happens. But the Bible tells us to expect it. And in fact, the way that we live in Great Britain is most odd and unusual in terms of how the church's experience has tended to be around the world. And probably it's unusual in terms of the church's experience in the world today. In the world today, we have an extraordinary privilege of living in a country where tolerance is the name of the game. It's a high value for us. Where we have a strongly Christian religious heritage, which is still valued, and where we have a system of law that works, and where we're protected. That is most unusual. Even in Europe, it's far riskier and more difficult to be an evangelical Christian. And you may well be restricted by law in ways that we are not currently in this country. If you are even in Africa at the moment, the pressure is there in all kinds of ways. It's partly because of the growth of militant Islam and other faiths that are non-Christian. It's partly a rejection of perceived Westernism. It's partly because to be authentically Christian and not to go down the route of corruption, not to make tribalism something that you go for, to have that kind of integrity about following Jesus is pretty tricky. And it's not that dissimilar in other nations of the world where actually wholehearted discipleship is a thing that's persecuted. Half-hearted discipleship tends not to get persecuted. Being friends with the world, making it easy for self, taking the backhanders, being open to corruption and bribery. Those were the sort of issues the early church faced. And very often, for them, the stark issue was, well, we may believe in Jesus, but if we compromise here, if we say the right words there, if we make that bribe here, whatever it is, we're going to be okay. But if we stand firm to a wholehearted discipleship, we're likely to get persecuted. And it may well be that the lack of persecution in our own lives is a reflection of the lack of wholehearted discipleship when it costs. But with Stephen, I would suspect that there are all kinds of issues as to why he was put to death, including that religious dogma and that religious jealousy, and also the demonically inspired hostility behind him. But the issue for the early church was, is this going to hinder the growth of the church or not? I don't know whether you've ever experienced rampant hostility because of your faith. And actually, as I reflect on my own Christian journey, there have been times where I've received significant threats because of my role as a Christian leader in one sphere or another. And some of those have been threats of violence or other sorts of intimidation. And though I've not really experienced persecution, I've experienced enough attempts to intimidate, or just to live with that, and to live with that for your children could be really, really, really difficult. And, you know, I'm one of the people in life who's fairly suffering averse. You know, I like to have my comfort. And if I was wanting to destroy the church, would intimidation threats be something that I would use if I was the enemy of the church? And how do you respond to threats and intimidation? Do you tend to go quiet? Do you tend to back off? Do you tend to back down? What does it do to you? And I think those are really important questions for us, because one of the chief goals of persecution is to quieten the witness of the church, to make it invalid, to shut it up, to tell it to be quiet. And there's something about the word witness and the word martyr that they belong together. And there's something about persecution which is actually, in the grace of God, it can go one way or the other. It can make people go quiet, or it can actually strengthen the witness of the church. And here, what happens in the book of Acts is that persecution seems to strengthen the witness of the church. The last verse that we read in Acts 8 verse 4 says that those who were scattered by the persecution preached the gospel wherever they went. And it seems as if in the economy of the kingdom of God, the events in Jerusalem around the death of Stephen actually propelled the church into society with a fresh impetus. First of all, it meant that those scattered people, wherever they went, took the gospel of Jesus. And instead of being in a kind of perhaps a fairly cozy bubble, maybe they were resistant to the gospel imperative to go to the nations and were staying where it was comfy. And when it became uncomfortable, they went. But there was something about the kind of boldness of their witness, I think, which is really impressive. And so that in the very next few verses in Acts chapter 8, we've got Philip in basically an alien culture and in a traditionally hostile culture in Samaria, preaching the good news of Jesus and performing signs and wonders, and that whole kind of community coming to faith. And it's just kind of an exponential increase in gospel. But let's just have a little reflection as I kind of come into land a little bit. So here's some of the positive fruits potentially around persecution and momentum. That people disperse and spread the gospel where they go. Second of all, the evidence of the authenticity of belief speaks as a witness, because if you're willing to suffer for your faith, then it's evident that you really believe it. I don't know how much Stephen's witness was key ultimately in Saul becoming a Christian, becoming Paul, but he's referenced twice in the passage we've just read. Saul having the clothes laid in front of him, Saul giving approval to his death. And when Saul, who becomes Paul, has an encounter with the risen Jesus on the Damascus Road, on his way into the capital of Syria to destroy the church there, Jesus speaks to him and says, you know, I'm Jesus who you're persecuting. And there's something about persecution and witness of the Spirit of Jesus that transforms someone who wants to destroy the church to someone who becomes the greatest missionary of the church. And part of what we hope and pray for is that the witness of the suffering church will lead to the conversion of the very people that persecute it. People who may have a misplaced zeal, but see something in the way that believers respond and the authenticity of their faith, which is the biggest challenge, because so many people who persecute the church actually believe lies and rubbish about the church. And when they will see it as it really is sometimes in the face of suffering. Here's another thing. There's a release of spiritual power and spiritual authority around suffering. And I think that that's true, actually. One of the we've been singing earlier on, you're a good father. You know, you're good all the time. And probably for us, our Western mindset often says, God's my father, I'm his child, he loves me, he wants to provide for me and protect me and nurture me. And we can be less comfortable with the idea that God, in his very nature, is a suffering God, and people who identify with him are called to share his vocation of suffering, and that suffering is a way that brings spiritual authority in the way that might doesn't. The way that the demonic works, the way that human defaults work, is to say that might is right. But when you've been the victim of might is right, you do not respect that might, do you? You may be subdued by it, but you hate it and you don't actually respect it. You don't respect the bully. You don't respect the right is might. But where someone suffers for what is right, it's incredible how much respect and spiritual authority that generates. And Jesus is crowned king, not by coming with legions of angels to destroy the Roman Empire. He's crowned king by going to the cross, and that's his coronation. And that's where the spiritual authority over the powers of darkness is broken. And the King of the Jews, who the name written over him, that's true. And in that place, he disarms spiritual powers. And I think the truth is that the witness of the church and church history will tell us is that spiritual authority comes through suffering. It's probably particularly been true in the church in China in the last century, where the kind of, if you like, the powerful Western, well-resourced missionaries left or were thrown out. And the church was in the hands of indigenous leaders who suffered and had tremendous spiritual authority. And some of those people like Brother Young and Brother Young and Watchman Nee, and you know, their spiritual authority has impacted us profoundly. I remember talking to Robert and Pam, visiting the underground church before the more enlightened times of China, just years ago, going there, and their testimony of encountering underground church leaders who suffered for their faith, been in prison, and the sense of spiritual authority coming from them, really powerful. So that's an issue. And I think we gain spiritual authority when we suffer for our faith. That might not be a comfy message, but I think it's a true one. And for the early church, what they wanted to do was to be identified with Jesus. They recognized that Jesus had come to identify with them, and they wanted to identify back. And for them, part of identifying with Jesus was being counted worthy to share in his sufferings. That's how the apostles respond to being beaten. They rejoiced they were counted worthy to share in his sufferings. Paul, in this great passage in Philippians, says, you know, I want to know him and to have the fellowship, even sharing in his sufferings, that I may attain the resurrection of the dead. And it's as if they're saying, look, if we're going to identify with Jesus, we're going to identify with all of it. Not just the glory, but the suffering. It's as if we don't want just a bit of Jesus, we want all of Jesus, and we believe that suffering is part of it. And I'm not sure that that's a message that we in the West have really got hold of, that an identification with Jesus Christ is an identification with a long-suffering God. Because we're so suffering averse. But God doesn't seem to be. And he doesn't seem to be with his followers, frankly, does he? So does being persecuted help us to identify more with Jesus? And does that have an incredible spiritual benefit for us? Does it purify us as it purifies the church? Peter, writing in his epistle, says, he who suffered in his body is done with sin. It's like, it's broken something, the power of sin over me, because I've suffered this particular way. Not been tested in that way. Not sure how I'd stand up. But I believe there's something in there. And I believe there's something in there for the church. Now, it's true, isn't it, that savage persecution, mass genocide, can wipe a church out. The church used to be strong in North Africa. That was, people like St. Augustine, Carthage, North Africa. Those were kind of key places where the church was strong. Ephesus. What's Ephesus like now as a Christian? There's places where Christians have been forcibly removed, exterminated, forcibly converted, and the church has suffered. But the worldwide church has grown and continues to grow. And in this era of the world where the church is being persecuted more than at any other time in church history, it continues to grow. So how do we respond to a church? And what does it mean for us to be part of a worldwide church? First of all, we should be praying. And the strategy for the church has always been to pray in the place of persecution. It's to pray for courage to be a witness. It's to pray for God to work in power. That's the New Testament way of praying. I want a door of opportunity to be open so I can be a more effective witness. Just read Paul's letters about what it means to suffer and to see God at work. It's extraordinary. Let's follow their example. Let's not be half-hearted about our faith, but let's be inspired that we can be associated with a bunch of martyrs. And let's see if we can try and live up at least to a little bit of what they're living up to in the lives that they are living in places of intense persecution and difficulty. Can we, third of all, react well to persecution when we encounter it? This is, it's not persecution at all. This was politics. But just a few weeks ago when, we had the little thing with the mayor. And by the way, I'm going to meet up with him in a couple of weeks' time, and we're going to have a nice time, the former mayor. But, in a sense, the negativity was a little bit like persecution, wasn't it? It's using a bit of hate language about Christians trying to sort of... But I think that we, as a Christian community, reacted well to that. And personally, for me, the message that I felt was right to do was to be, not try and fight fire with fire, and to try and keep as open and generous an attitude as possible. And I think that for me, I felt that gave me spiritual authority. And I think it helped a spiritual thing in our city at that time, to be honest. And I guess maybe whenever we encounter forms of persecution, how we react is going to be a test as to whether God's going to use that for good, or whether we're going to find ourselves colluding with the very powers that undermine. Can we ourselves not persecute others? And what I mean by that is, some of the reasons that people are persecuted, they could happen to us. I mean, for instance, it's a little detail. But if people get persecuted when they leave their religion and join another one because it seemed as disloyal, does that ever happen when someone leaves a church and joins another church? Or when someone embraces a theology which is like perhaps a new emphasis that you don't particularly hold or agree? And how do you, I'm sure you're not going to be putting them in prison, but do you think well of them and want to bless them in that new state or not? Because there's a seed there of the persecuting mindset, isn't there? And that will hinder the growth of the church. If we can have a mindset that says we are going to bless in all circumstances, speak well, think well, bless well, then that's going to be a good thing. And are we going to speak out via agencies like Christian Solidarity Worldwide or Open Doors or Release International? Are we going to write to our MPs? Are we going to stand for the persecuted church? Are we going to give to the persecuted church? Are we going to try and make resources available so that where there is kind of, perhaps in a natural disaster and the church doesn't get access, are we going to make sure that there are Christian agencies where we can make sure resources go? But I think in all these things, we're in a battle that's not flesh and blood, but is spiritual. And it's a battle that's going to be won in prayer.